In 1839, a British official in China wrote a letter to Queen Victoria asking her to stop her merchants from poisoning an entire civilization, and the letter was never answered, and the war that followed was not fought to stop the poisoning, but to protect the right to continue it, and the British won, and the treaty they imposed at gunpoint opened 5 Chinese ports to trade and gave Britain the island of Hong Kong and established the principle that a Western power could force a sovereign nation to accept whatever terms it chose at the barrel of a cannon, and what was being traded through those ports in enormous quantities was opium, and within a generation roughly 1 in 3 adult Chinese males was addicted, and the British government knew exactly what it was doing and did it anyway because the profits were extraordinary and the victims were not British subjects, and the story of how that happened is one of the most deliberately concealed episodes in the history of the British Empire. To understand how a government could do something this deliberately and this systematically, you need to understand the economic problem that Britain faced in the late 18th century, because what happened in China did not begin with malice, it began with a trade imbalance and a commercial calculation, and the solution that British merchants and eventually the British government chose to that imbalance was one of the most consequential and most deliberately harmful decisions in the history of international commerce. Britain wanted Chinese goods with an intensity that had no equivalent on the other side of the relationship. Silk and porcelain, and above all tea, which had become so central to British culture by the 1790s that the population consumed it in quantities that would seem extraordinary by modern standards, and that required constant resupply from a source that was not particularly interested in receiving anything in exchange. The Qing dynasty which ruled China had no equivalent desire for anything Britain produced, and the Chinese emperor had told the British ambassador George Macartney in 1793 with a directness that the British found deeply insulting and that they could not quite believe was genuine, that China possessed all things in prolific abundance within its own borders and had no need to import the manufactures of outside barbarians in exchange for its products, and what that statement meant in practical economic terms was that Britain was sending enormous quantities of silver into China every year to pay for goods it wanted, and receiving very little back in return, and the silver was draining out of the British economy in a way that concerned both merchants and the government with a seriousness that modern readers may find difficult to fully appreciate. Silver was not simply a medium of exchange in the 18th century world the way money functions in a modern economy. It was the foundation of currency and credit and international trade in ways that made its outflow genuinely alarming to people who understood the mechanics of how commercial systems worked. The East India Company, which was effectively a private corporation with the power of a government and its own army and its own foreign policy, had been looking for years for something that Chinese consumers would buy in large enough quantities to reverse that flow of silver, and when they found it, the discovery was both commercially elegant and morally catastrophic in ways that would reshape the relationship between Asia and the Western world for the next century and beyond. The poppy fields of Bengal, which Britain controlled after the conquest of large parts of India, produced opium in quantities that could be scaled almost indefinitely with sufficient investment and organization, and Chinese consumers had demonstrated over time a willingness to pay for it that exceeded almost anything else the company had available to sell through its trading networks. The trade had existed before British involvement on a small and relatively contained scale. Opium had been used medicinally in China for centuries, and recreational use existed but was limited, and the Qing government had banned the importation of opium for recreational use in 1729 precisely because officials who understood the early dynamics of addiction could already see what unrestricted access would eventually produce in a large population. But the scale of what the British were about to bring to the Chinese market was something the 1729 ban had never contemplated, because nobody in the 18th century had yet attempted to run an industrial-scale drug trade across an entire civilization with the organizational capacity and the naval power and the commercial infrastructure that Britain could now deploy in support of it. What the East India Company built in Bengal was not simply a drug trade, it was a vertically integrated system of production, processing, and distribution that was designed from the beginning with the explicit goal of maximizing addiction among Chinese consumers, because addiction was what produced reliable and repeating demand in a way that the consumption of any freely chosen good could never match. The mechanism the East India Company used to move the product from Bengal to Chinese consumers was deliberately designed to provide a layer of deniability that the company's directors found useful when the question of moral responsibility came up in British parliamentary debates, where there was genuine opposition from people who found the entire enterprise difficult to defend on any moral grounds that polite Victorian society would recognize. The company did not sell opium to China directly. Instead, it sold opium at auction in Calcutta to private merchants called country traders, who then transported the drug to the Chinese coast on their own ships and sold it through networks of Chinese distributors, who moved it inland through bribery and corruption and the systematic complicity of local officials, who could be purchased far more cheaply than they could be compelled to enforce a ban against a product that their own superiors in many cases were also consuming. The company thus collected the revenue from the Bengal opium monopoly and could claim in its accounts and in its public statements that it was not itself engaged in the opium trade with China, while simultaneously depending on that trade for a substantial and growing portion of its annual income and structuring its entire Bengal revenue system around the assumption that the trade would continue and expand indefinitely. It was a mechanism of institutional hypocrisy refined to a high art over decades of practice, and it worked well enough that the trade grew from roughly 1,000 chests of opium per year in the 1770s to over 40,000 chests per year by the late 1830s, an increase of roughly 40 times in less than 70 years. A chest of opium contained roughly 140 pounds of the drug, and each chest could supply enough raw material to produce addiction in a substantial number of people depending on their usage patterns and the concentration of the product they were able to obtain. And by the 1830s, the quantities flowing into China were sufficient to produce the mass addiction that reformers within the country had been warning about for decades. Chinese officials who traveled through the southern provinces where the trade had penetrated most deeply sent reports to the emperor describing what they witnessed with a desperation that communicates itself across the centuries, even in the bureaucratic language through which such reports were required to be expressed. Officials unable to perform their duties because they were addicted themselves, soldiers incapable of responding to emergencies because they were under the influence of the drug, merchants ruining their families by spending money that should have gone to feeding their children on maintaining habits they could no longer control, farmers neglecting their fields during critical periods of the agricultural calendar because the need for the drug was more immediate than the need to tend crops that would not produce income for months, and underneath all of these specific consequences a general social dissolution that the reports described with a horror that suggests the writers understood they were witnessing something qualitatively different from the ordinary problems of governance that officials were trained to address. The silver flow had reversed exactly as the British merchants had intended from the beginning of the expansion of the trade. Instead of British silver flowing into China to pay for tea and silk, Chinese silver was now flowing out of China to pay for opium in quantities that were beginning to produce serious macroeconomic effects on the Qing dynasty's ability to function as a governing system. Taxes became harder to collect because people who should have been paying in silver were paying in copper, and the exchange rates between the two metals were moving against the government in ways that reduced the real value of tax revenues, even when the nominal amounts collected remained stable. Commissioner Lin Zexu was appointed by the Daoguang Emperor in 1838 to solve the opium problem, and Lin was something genuinely unusual within the Qing bureaucratic system. He was a genuine idealist who believed that careful investigation followed by the determined application of proper authority could actually solve even large and deeply entrenched problems. He approached the assignment with a thoroughness and a seriousness that suggests he genuinely believed that demonstrating the strength and the legitimacy of Chinese law would be sufficient to make the British merchants comply with it, because in his understanding of how the world worked, legitimate authority properly exercised commanded obedience even from people who would prefer to evade it. He ordered foreign merchants to surrender their opium stocks, and when they resisted, he blockaded the foreign trading enclave in Canton, cutting off food supplies until they capitulated and handing the stocks over to Chinese authorities. He collected over 1 million kilograms of opium from British and other foreign merchants and destroyed it all in a process that took 23 days and involved thousands of workers who mixed the drug with salt and lime in large trenches dug for the purpose and then flushed the resulting mixture into the sea. And before he did any of this, he wrote the letter to Queen Victoria that has become one of the most remarkable documents in the history of imperial relationships. The letter was a long and careful argument making the moral case against the opium trade in terms that Victoria or any educated British reader would have recognized as entirely coherent within the framework of values that British society publicly claimed to hold. Lin pointed out that Britain had laws against the opium trade within its own borders and asked why those laws did not apply to the actions of British merchants in China. He argued that the deliberate poisoning of another nation's population for commercial gain was a violation of the basic principles of justice and human decency that transcended cultural and national boundaries. He was not wrong on any of these points, and the letter was apparently never delivered to Victoria directly, though copies eventually made their way into British newspapers where some editors found the arguments sufficiently embarrassing to print. But the response of the British government was not to engage with a moral argument, but to treat the destruction of the opium as a commercial crime against British subjects that demanded military redress. The decision to go to war had effectively already been made before Lin destroyed the opium, because the commercial interests and the national pride that had been wounded by Chinese attempts to enforce their own laws and the broader strategic project of forcing open Chinese markets to British trade had aligned in a way that made confrontation almost inevitable regardless of what the Chinese authorities did or did not do. The First Opium War began in 1839, and the military outcome was never genuinely in doubt once the full weight of British naval power was brought to bear, because the gap in military technology between Britain and China in 1839 was wider than either side fully understood before the fighting started. And this is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the asymmetry of what followed. It was not that Chinese soldiers were unwilling to fight, or that Chinese officials were indifferent to the outcome. It was that the technology gap in naval warfare and in artillery and in the logistical capacity to sustain military operations over long distances had opened to a degree that made the result predetermined once the decision to fight was made. British steamships could move against the wind and tide in ways that made Chinese coastal defenses obsolete, because those defenses had been designed for an era of sail when the attacker had to approach you on terms that the geography and the weather partly determined, rather than wherever he chose, whenever he chose, regardless of what the wind was doing. British artillery was superior in range and accuracy and rate of fire, and the iron discipline of British troops trained to fire and reload in precise mechanical sequences under fire was something that Chinese forces largely lacked, not because of any deficiency of courage or motivation, but because they had not developed the same drill systems that the European powers had refined over centuries of warfare against each other. The war produced a series of engagements that were military mismatches, producing Chinese casualties that were multiples of British losses in every significant encounter, and the Qing government discovered to its horror and to its lasting shame that it could not defend its coastline against a determined modern naval power regardless of how many men it committed to the attempt. And the treaties that ended the war rewrote the terms on which China existed as a political entity in its relationship with the Western powers in ways that the Chinese have never forgotten. The Treaty of Nanking in 1842 ended the First War, and the terms established a pattern that would be repeated and expanded in the subsequent decades as other powers recognized the model that Britain had demonstrated. 5 ports, including Shanghai and Canton, were open to British trade with fixed low tariffs that China could not change without British consent, which meant that China could not protect its own domestic industries by adjusting the cost of imported goods competing with them. Britain received Hong Kong Island in perpetuity. A large indemnity was paid to compensate British merchants for the opium that Lin had destroyed, which meant that the British government had gone to war and won a war in order to ensure that drug dealers were compensated for drugs that a foreign government had confiscated in the legitimate exercise of its own laws. And extraterritoriality was established, meaning that British subjects in China were subject to British law rather than Chinese law, regardless of what they did on Chinese soil to Chinese people. Opium was not mentioned explicitly in the treaty, partly because the British negotiators were aware that making the drug trade the explicit centerpiece of the peace terms would create difficulties in Parliament, where there was genuine and articulate opposition to the war from people who found the entire enterprise morally indefensible and who were capable of making that case in terms that could sway public opinion if given sufficient prominence. But the trade continued and expanded because the port openings facilitated it, and the indemnity had reimbursed the merchants, and the underlying commercial logic that had driven the expansion of the trade in the first place had not changed in any way. The Second War came in 1856 over a dispute involving a ship called the Arrow, and the pretext was so thin that even some British statesmen who supported the broader project of opening China to Western trade found it embarrassing to defend in public. The Arrow was a former Chinese pirate vessel that had been registered as British, and whose registration had in fact expired before the incident that triggered the war actually occurred. The Chinese authorities had boarded the ship and arrested some of its crew members on piracy charges that appear to have been entirely legitimate, and the British consul in Canton, Harry Parkes, decided to treat this as an insult to the British flag and escalated the dispute in ways that made war almost unavoidable. The pretext was insufficient, but it was sufficient, and France joined Britain in this second conflict over the objection of the Chinese government that what was really happening was a military operation in support of a drug trade that both European powers were now profiting from in one way or another. The result was even more devastating for the Qing dynasty than the First War had been, because by this point the dynasty was also fighting the Taiping rebellion internally, and the resources it was trying to direct toward its defense had to be divided in ways that made both efforts less effective than either would have been on its own. British and French forces captured Canton and then marched on Beijing, and in an act of deliberate cultural destruction that the British commander Lord Elgin ordered as a punishment for the torture of British prisoners, burned and looted the Summer Palace, which was an extraordinary complex of gardens and pavilions and libraries and galleries built over generations by the Qing emperors and containing irreplaceable artworks and historical artifacts and manuscripts that had been accumulating for centuries. The burning took 3 days, and the smoke was visible in Beijing, and foreign observers who witnessed it described the scene with a combination of awe and shame that captures the fundamental ambivalence that characterized the British relationship with what it was doing in China throughout this entire period. The Treaty of Tientsin and the Convention of Peking that ended the Second War went considerably further than the first set of treaties had gone. Opium was now explicitly legalized, and the Chinese government was required to tax it through a system that made the dynasty formally complicit in the trade that was destroying its own population, because the revenue it generated was genuinely useful, and the alternative was to refuse and fight another war that the military situation made it clear China could not win. More ports were opened to Western commerce. Foreigners received the right to travel freely throughout China's interior for the first time. Christian missionaries received the right to evangelize throughout the country and to acquire property for that purpose. The effects on the Chinese population accumulated over decades in ways that statistics struggle to capture fully because the damage was not simply measurable in economic terms but expressed itself across every dimension of social organization. By the 1880s, estimates of the number of opium addicts in China ranged from several million to tens of millions of people depending on how addiction was defined and what sources were used, and the social consequences cascaded through every institution that Chinese society depended on to function. Families were impoverished in ways that extended across generations as patriarchs sold household goods and eventually the household itself to maintain habits they could not control. Officials who should have been administering justice and collecting taxes and maintaining order were consuming the drug on duty and accepting bribes from the networks that distributed it rather than suppressing them as their legal obligations required. The military deterioration was perhaps the most consequential consequence because it was the military that ultimately determined whether the dynasty could defend its territory from internal and external threats, and the army of the 1880s was a shadow of what it had been before the opium century. Recruitment was difficult because the population of physically capable young men who were not addicted or weakened by addiction was smaller than it should have been. Training was degraded because officers who were supposed to maintain discipline were themselves addicted or were profiting from the trade and had no incentive to suppress it. Equipment was neglected because the funds that should have gone to maintaining it were being diverted into the pockets of officials who had learned that the opium trade was the most reliable source of unofficial income available to anyone with the authority to tax or protect or ignore it. There was resistance within Britain to the opium trade throughout this entire period, and it came from people who made arguments that were morally sophisticated and factually accurate, and that engaged honestly with the evidence of what the trade was producing in China. William Gladstone, who was at various points in his long career the most significant liberal politician in Victorian Britain, made some of the strongest parliamentary speeches against the opium trade and called the First Opium War the most unjust war in British history and the most calculated to cover England with permanent disgrace. Missionaries who had actually lived in China and witnessed the effects of mass addiction firsthand wrote accounts that were read by substantial audiences, and that should have produced legislative action. But these arguments were consistently defeated in Parliament by a combination of commercial interests that had too much money invested in the trade to accept its abolition, and by a broader ideological framework that held that free trade was a principle that overrode other considerations in ways that made restriction of any commodity morally problematic regardless of what that commodity did to the people who consumed it. The free trade argument was particularly effective and particularly pernicious because it dressed the drug trade in the respectable language of economic liberalism that Victorian Britain had elevated almost to the level of natural law. To restrict the opium trade was to restrict free commerce, and to restrict free commerce was to violate a principle that the dominant economic philosophy of the era treated as foundational to human progress and social organization. The legal opium trade finally ended in 1917, when the last shipments from India arrived in China under a series of agreements that British reformers had worked for decades to achieve, and that the Chinese government had been pressing for throughout the preceding half-century. But by that point China had developed its own domestic opium production that was extensive enough to supply demand without imports, and the domestic trade continued into the 1950s when the communist government that had come to power in 1949 suppressed it through methods that included mass execution of dealers and through campaigns of public denunciation and forced treatment for addicts that were extraordinarily brutal in their methods, but that were effective in ending within a few years a habit of mass addiction that more humane approaches had not been able to address over the preceding century. What makes the opium story different from other examples of colonial exploitation that historians of empire have documented extensively is the deliberateness and the sustained intentionality of it over a period of more than a century. Britain did not accidentally impoverish China or inadvertently introduce a harmful substance into Chinese society as a byproduct of some other activity whose harmful effects were not anticipated. The East India Company and then the British government made a series of conscious choices across multiple generations to create, maintain, expand, and defend with military force twice a trade, whose primary product was the addiction of as many Chinese consumers as possible, because addiction was what made the trade profitable and reliable and self-sustaining in a way that the consumption of any freely chosen good could never match. The documents from this period are not ambiguous, and historians who have worked through them have not needed to read between the lines or speculate about intentions, because the intentions were stated directly in internal correspondence by people who knew they were not writing for public consumption. Officials at every level of the British administrative system, from company directors in London to colonial governors in India to consuls in Chinese ports, understood what the trade produced in the Chinese population and chose to continue it and expand it, and to go to war twice to protect the commercial infrastructure that sustained it, and to write treaties that legalized it, and to collect taxes on it, and to invest the proceeds in the administration of an empire that simultaneously presented itself to the world as the carrier of civilization and progress and Christian values to the less fortunate portions of humanity. The gap between that self-presentation and the reality of what was actually happening in the poppy fields of Bengal and the distribution networks of coastal China is so wide and so thoroughly documented that it constitutes one of the most striking examples of collective institutional hypocrisy in the historical record. And it is an example that has not received the sustained public attention in Britain or in Western educational systems generally that it would receive if the victims had been European rather than Asian. The Opium Wars appear in British history education as a minor colonial episode, rather than as a defining moral catastrophe that shaped everything that came after it in the relationship between China and the Western world. China has not forgotten, and the historical memory of what happened during what the Chinese call the century of humiliation that began with the First Opium War and ended with the establishment of the People's Republic in 1949 is a living presence in Chinese political culture that shapes how Chinese leaders talk about sovereignty and about the relationship between China and the powers that imposed those unequal treaties on a government that lacked the military capacity to resist them. When Chinese officials talk about never again allowing outside powers to humiliate China, they are referring to something specific and historically grounded that their grandparents and great-grandparents lived through, and that their great-great-grandparents survived in the form of mass addiction and military defeat, and the burning of the Summer Palace, whose ruins still stand in Beijing as a deliberate monument to what was lost. The number of Chinese people whose lives were shortened or destroyed by addiction during the century of the opium trade is not precisely calculable, because the record-keeping of the period was not designed with that question in mind, and because addiction produces death through multiple pathways that are not always recorded as addiction-related. But the estimates that historians have produced suggest numbers that dwarf the casualties of most of the wars that dominate the historical memory of the 19th century. And unlike those wars, this was not a conflict between parties who had chosen to fight each other, but a deliberate commercial strategy whose entire purpose was to hook as many people as possible and to use military force to prevent anyone from interfering with the hooking. Write in the comments which part of this you were never taught in school, because I want to know how much of what happened in those 80 years between the First Opium War and the end of the trade in 1917 was completely new to you, and how much of it changes the way you think about the history of how the modern world was built.